are moments in life that seem ordinary while you're living them, until one decision changes everything that comes after. For me, it was a phone call. I was sitting at my desk finishing a quarterly financial report when my cell phone lit up. Harrison and Cole Attorneys. I smiled before answering. I already knew why they were calling. "Hello, Miss Carter," Mr. Harrison said warmly. "I have some good news. The probate process has finally been completed. Your grandmother's estate has officially been transferred." For a second, I couldn't speak. Not because of the money, because hearing those words made losing her feel real all over again. My grandmother, Evelyn Carter, had been gone for almost 6 months. Cancer took her far quicker than any of us expected. She wasn't just my grandmother. She was the woman who raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. She taught me how to balance a checkbook before I learned algebra. She taught me that kindness wasn't weakness, and every Sunday after church, she'd bake peach cobbler while telling me stories about people she'd met. During her 35 years as an estate lawyer, she'd seen siblings drag each other into court over houses. Children stop speaking to parents over wills. Marriages crumble because someone inherited money. I used to tell her she watched too many crime shows. She'd laugh. Then she'd say something that never made sense until much later. "Money doesn't change people, sweetheart. It simply gives them permission to show you who they've always been." Back then, I thought she was being dramatic. After all, the people in my life loved me, didn't they? Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, bringing me back to the present. "The amount has been deposited exactly as stated in Mrs. Carter's will. $750,000. I thanked him, hung up, then stared out my office window for what felt like forever. $750,000. It didn't feel exciting. It felt heavy, like someone had placed a responsibility in my hands instead of a gift. When I got home that evening, Derek was already setting the dining table. The smell of garlic butter drifted through the house. He looked up and smiled. "There she is, my hard-working wife." I walked over and kissed him. For a moment, everything felt normal, safe, exactly the way newly married life was supposed to feel. "So," he grinned, "did the lawyer call today?" I blinked. I hadn't told him they were supposed to call. Not today. Not this week. In fact, I'd barely mentioned the estate at all since Grandma's funeral. I forced a smile. "Yeah, he did." Derek's eyes brightened almost instantly. "That's amazing. I'm so happy for you." He wrapped me in a hug. And if the story had ended there, I would have sworn I'd married the kindest man in the world. But as he held me, he asked one tiny question, a question most people would have ignored. "So, when does the money become available?" I don't know why, but something inside me shifted, not because of what he asked, because of how quickly he asked it, almost as if he'd been waiting for that phone call too. I smiled. It's still being finalized. It was a lie. The money had already been transferred. I don't know why I lied. Maybe instinct speaks before logic does. Maybe Grandma's voice had buried itself somewhere deep inside me. Or maybe, for the first time since saying, "I do," I felt something I couldn't explain. A quiet, persistent feeling that whispered, "Don't tell anyone where the money is." And looking back now, that feeling may have been the reason I survived everything that happened next. The funny thing about intuition, it rarely arrives like a thunderstorm. It doesn't scream, it whispers. At first, I told myself I was being ridiculous. Derek had done nothing wrong. He'd simply asked when the inheritance would be available. A husband asking about his wife's finances wasn't exactly unusual. Still, Grandma's words refused to leave my mind. Money doesn't change people. It simply gives them permission to show you who they've always been. I shook the thought away. I didn't want suspicion to become the first guest in our marriage. The next morning, Derek kissed my forehead before leaving for work. "I'll see you tonight," he said, with that same warm smile I'd fallen in love with. "I was thinking maybe we should celebrate this weekend." "Celebrate what?" I laughed. "You know," he winked. "Our new chapter." I smiled. "That sounds nice." "It'll be your treat," he chuckled. I think you're forgetting you're the rich one now. He laughed after saying it. I laughed too, but something about that sentence lingered longer than it should have. That evening, Diane invited us over for dinner. She'd been nothing but kind since the day I met her. Elegant, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who never raised her voice. She treated me like the daughter she'd always wanted. Or at least, that's what I believed. Dinner was lovely. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh bread she'd baked that afternoon. Everything felt normal until dessert. Diane placed a slice of apple pie in front of me and smiled. So, sweetheart, have you thought about what you'll do with your grandmother's money? I almost dropped my fork. I looked at Derek. He avoided my eyes by reaching for his glass of water. I haven't really thought about it, I answered carefully. Oh, Diane smiled. I thought maybe you two would finally buy a bigger house. Derek nodded almost immediately. I've actually been looking online. You have? I asked. Just browsing. He shrugged. You deserve a nicer place. His answer sounded sweet, but it was the first time I'd heard him mention moving. We'd only been married for 7 days. 7 days. I smiled politely. I actually love this house. Well, Diane said gently, marriage is about building together. Sometimes that means combining everything. There was that word. Everything. The conversation moved on, but my appetite disappeared. Later that night, as Derek slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling. Maybe they meant nothing by it. Maybe I was allowing grief to make me paranoid. Maybe, or maybe not. The next afternoon, I received another call from Mr. Harrison. Everything settled in okay? He asked. Yes. I actually wanted to ask you something. Of course. If someone wanted access to the inheritance, what would they need? There was a short pause. Only your authorization. Unless what? Unless you choose to move the funds into a protected trust. A trust? It keeps the assets legally separate. No one, not even a spouse, can access them without your approval. I stared through my office window. Can I still do that? Absolutely. It's your inheritance. You don't need anyone's permission. When the call ended, I didn't make the decision immediately. I sat alone in my office for almost an hour. One part of me felt guilty. Was I really considering protecting money from my own husband? The man I'd promised forever? Then another memory surfaced. It was 2 weeks before Grandma died. She could barely lift her head from the hospital pillow. She reached for my hand and smiled. If you're ever forced to choose between hurting someone's feelings and protecting your peace, choose your peace. The people who truly love you will understand. By the time I left work that evening, my decision had been made. The next morning, before anyone woke up, I drove to the bank. Not because I had proof, not because I believed Derek was planning anything, but because peace of mind was worth far more than $750,000. As the bank manager slid the trust documents across the desk, I picked up the pen, signed my name, and unknowingly changed the ending of my own story. The moment I signed those trust documents, I expected to feel guilty. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. Relief. It was strange. Nothing had happened. No one had threatened me. No one had asked me for money. And yet, the weight on my shoulders suddenly felt lighter. The bank manager smiled as he handed me a copy of the paperwork. Mrs. Carter, your inheritance is now fully protected. If anyone ever attempts to access these funds without your authorization, the request will automatically be denied. I nodded. Thank you. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't help but laugh at myself. Maybe I really was overthinking everything. Maybe one day I'd tell Derek what I'd done, and we'd laugh about how cautious I'd been. I wanted that to be true, more than anything. That evening, Derek came home carrying a bouquet of white lilies. My beautiful wife deserves flowers for absolutely no reason. I smiled. You know lilies are my favorite. I know. He kissed my forehead. I've been paying attention. For a few minutes, everything felt normal again. We cooked dinner together, argued playfully over whether the pasta needed more parmesan, watched an old romantic comedy we'd both seen a dozen times. By bedtime, I almost felt embarrassed for doubting him. Maybe grief had simply made me suspicious. Maybe I needed to stop looking for problems that didn't exist. Saturday morning, Diane invited us to brunch. Her house overlooked a small lake just outside the city. It was peaceful, the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. She greeted me with a warm hug. "My favorite daughter-in-law," I laughed. "I'm your only daughter-in-law. And my favorite." She winked. Everything about Diane felt effortless. She never seemed controlling, never rude. She had this calming presence that made people trust her almost immediately, which is why what happened next caught me completely off guard. While Derek stepped outside to answer a phone call, Diane leaned closer. "So, sweetheart, I've been thinking." I looked up from my coffee. "About what?" "Marriage." She smiled gently. "My late husband handled all our finances. It made life so much easier." I nodded politely. She stirred her tea. "You know, now that you and Derek are married, it might be wise to put everything under one financial plan." I smiled. "We haven't really talked about that yet." "Oh, you should." She said it so casually. "So there aren't any secrets between you?" Then she added something that made my stomach tighten. "Money should never belong to one spouse. It should belong to the marriage." Before I could respond, Derek walked back inside. The conversation ended, but my mind didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of what Diane had said, because of how perfectly rehearsed it sounded. Almost like she'd given that advice before Monday morning. I arrived at work early. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed. It was Derek. "Derek, hey babe, quick question." I smiled. "What's up?" 3 little dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, his message came through. "Derek, did you ever decide which bank you kept your grandmother's inheritance in?" I stared at the screen. I didn't answer immediately. A few seconds later, another message arrived. "Derek, just curious." Curious. Such a harmless word. But something about it didn't feel harmless anymore. I typed a reply. "Why do you ask?" He responded almost instantly. "No reason. I was just wondering." I read those 4 words over and over again. Then I locked my phone without replying. That evening, I got home before Derek. We had dinner, and everything felt normal for Nias. Few minutes after I got into the bed, he casually says, "You know, we should probably start using a password manager." I laughed. "Why?" "Married couples should have access to each other's accounts in case of emergencies." I smiled politely but said nothing. It sounded reasonable, and maybe it was. But after everything else that had happened, it no longer felt like a suggestion. It felt like another piece of a puzzle I couldn't yet see. For the next 3 days, I acted exactly the same. I laughed at his jokes. We had dinner together every evening. We even spent Friday night watching old home videos from our wedding. If Derek suspected anything, he never showed it. Neither did Diane. And slowly, I started wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. Until the following Tuesday. That morning, my manager called me into his office. "Marlene," he said, "our afternoon client meeting has been postponed. You can head home if you'd like." I looked at the clock. It was only 1:15 p.m. I smiled. A surprise afternoon off. I texted Derek. Meeting got cancelled. Thinking of grabbing lunch with Sarah before coming home. Almost immediately, he replied, "Derek, sounds good. Take your time. Love you." I smiled at the screen. Then, I put my phone away. The truth was, there was no lunch with Sarah. For reasons I couldn't explain, I wanted to go home. Maybe it was instinct again. Maybe it was coincidence. Whatever it was, it changed my life. When I pulled into the driveway, Derek's car was already there. That surprised me. He wasn't supposed to be home until after 5. Then I noticed another familiar car parked behind his. Diane's. I frowned. Why were they both here? I quietly stepped out of my car. The front door wasn't completely closed. It was slightly open, just enough for me to hear voices inside. Try it again. That was Diane. It should be this one. I already tried, Derek whispered sharply. It locked me out. Keep your voice down. My heart dropped. I slowly pushed the door open. Neither of them heard me. They were standing in the kitchen, exactly where I'd left my laptop that morning. My laptop was open. Derek's fingers were flying across the keyboard. Diane stood beside him, reading from a small notebook she'd pulled from her handbag. No, she muttered. Try your anniversary. I did. Her birthday didn't work. What about Evelyn's birthday? I told you, none of them are working. Then, the computer made a loud sound. A bright red message filled the screen. Account locked, too many failed login attempts. The room fell silent. That's when Derek looked up. Our eyes met. The color drained from his face. Diane turned around so quickly that the notebook slipped from her hand and landed on the floor. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, Derek forced a weak smile. Marlene, it's not what you think. I looked at the laptop, then at the notebook lying on the floor. Its pages had fallen open. Across the top of one page, written in Diane's handwriting, were the words, Marlene, estate underneath, a list of dates. Passwords they'd guessed, the name of my bank, and one sentence that made my blood run cold. Transfer before she notices. I slowly bent down and picked up the notebook. Neither of them tried to stop me. Diane's lips trembled. Dear, we can explain. I looked from her to Derek, then back at the notebook. For the first time since I'd met either of them, I wasn't looking at my husband or my mother-in-law. I was looking at two people I'd never really known. I closed the notebook. Then, as calmly as I could, I asked one question. How long? Neither of them answered. How long have you been planning this? Derek opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence was answer enough. The silence between us lasted so long, I could hear the refrigerator humming behind me. Derek looked at the floor. Diane looked at me. Neither of them had the courage to answer my question, so I asked it again. How long? This time, Derek finally spoke. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I let out a quiet laugh. You know, that wasn't my question. He rubbed both hands over his face. I never wanted to steal from you. I looked down at the notebook still resting in my hands. Passwords, my bank's name, transfer instructions, a list of everything they had tried. Then I looked back at him. It certainly looks like you did. His eyes filled with tears. Marlene, I loved you before I ever knew about the inheritance. For a second, I believed him, because part of me knew it was true. The man I met 2 years earlier, the man who remembered my favorite flowers, the man who called Grandma every Sunday, that man had been real. At least, I wanted to believe he was. So what changed? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. Diane did. She stepped forward, her voice calm, almost offended. Nothing changed. You're married. What's yours is his. I turned toward her. My grandmother left that inheritance to me. She folded her arms. And you're his wife. Do you know how many marriages fail because spouses keep secrets? This wasn't a secret. It was my inheritance. It was my security. Diane shook her head. No. It was supposed to become your family's future. Then she looked directly at Derek. I told you this would happen. She's never trusted you. I watched Derek close his eyes. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't a conversation they'd had once. They'd had it dozens of times. Little by little, question by question, doubt had become entitlement, and entitlement had become greed. I looked back at Derek. Did you really think I would have refused to help you if you needed something? His shoulders slumped. No. Then why? His voice cracked. Because Mum kept saying, he swallowed hard, that if you were willing to hide the money, one day you'd hide everything else. He wiped his eyes. She said married people shouldn't have separate money. She said if I didn't take control now, I'd spend the rest of my life asking permission from my own wife. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So instead, you decided to break into my bank account. He covered his face. I know how insane it sounds. I told myself I just wanted to see the balance. I wasn't going to transfer anything. I slowly lifted the notebook. What about this? What about the words? Transfer before she notices. Derek stared at the page, confused. He looked at his mother. Dad? No, he whispered. Mum. Diane's expression never changed. She simply sighed. I wrote that. The room fell silent again. She looked at me without a hint of shame. You would have come around eventually. But if you didn't? We had to protect Derek. I almost laughed. Protect him? From his own wife? She nodded. I've seen women destroy men financially. I wasn't going to let that happen to my son. I looked at Derek. He looked completely shattered. For the first time since I'd walked through that front door, I realized something. Diane hadn't forced him. She hadn't controlled him. She had simply fed the fear that was already inside him. And instead of trusting his wife, he trusted the loudest voice in the room. I gently placed the notebook back on the counter. Then I picked up my handbag. Derek looked up. Where are you going? I slipped my wedding ring off my finger. Not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly. I placed it beside the notebook. The one thing my grandmother couldn't leave me was the ability to choose the right husband. A tear rolled down Derek's cheek. Marlene, please, we can fix this. I smiled sadly. No, we can't. You don't rebuild trust after someone tries to steal it. I walked toward the front door. Behind me, I heard my name one last time, but I didn't turn around. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. Because my inheritance had been placed in a protected trust before any of this happened. Neither Derek nor anyone else could touch a single dollar. My attorney also submitted the security logs from my bank, documenting every failed login attempt, along with photographs of Diane's notebook. Derek never fought the divorce. He never asked for a share of the inheritance. He simply signed the papers. The last thing he ever said to me was, I should have trusted you instead of listening to everyone else. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I was finally free. Grandma used to tell me, money doesn't change people. It simply gives them permission to show you who they've always been. For a long time, I thought she was talking about greed. Now I know she was talking about trust. Because the greatest inheritance she ever gave me wasn't $750,000. It was the wisdom that saved it, and maybe saved me. Sometimes, the greatest betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people we trusted enough to hand them the keys to our hearts. If you were in my shoes, would you have forgiven Derek? Or would you have walked away the moment trust was broken? Tell me what you would have done in the comments. And if stories about love, betrayal, second chances, and life's hardest lessons resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe to Echoes Before Goodbye, because every goodbye leaves behind an echo. I'll see you in the next story.